obligation in current legislation requiring HRI to comply with the requirements of the Code of Practice for the Governance of State Bodies, or for the RRB to report to HRI, and this deficiency is being addressed. There are insufficient provisions in the current legislation with regard to the procedure for making payments to HRI and to Bord na Gun to allow the Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine to withhold financial support if he is dissatisfied with the strategic and other plans submitted to support any funding proposals or their implementation. It is proposed to provide an explicit permission for the Minister to withhold funding instalments if he is dissatisfied with the strategic or other plans submitted to support any funding proposals or their implementation. Funding may also be withheld where HRI or Bord na Gun have failed to provide information requested by the Minister or to comply with the direction of the Minister. Similarly, the RRB shall be required to furnish information to HRI in relation to its activities when requested to do so, and this information may be taken into account by HRI in determining the annual budgetary requirements of the RRB. The accounts of the RRB will be audited by the Controller and Auditor General and published. The Chief Executive of the RRB will be obliged to attend to the Oireachtas committees as required. There is also a provision permitting the Minister to require the HRI and the RRB to agree procedures to ensure compliance with government codes of practice, guidelines or policy documents, and in relation to the provision of financial and other information in relation to any matter funded by HRI. The scheme also empowers HRI to make various deductions from prize money in accordance with HRI directives. This is essentially a reflection of current practice. However, HRI cannot make changes in the directives governing deductions for charitable funds administered by RRB without prior agreement of the racing regulatory body. And this provision is intended to protect the status quo because the RRB funds a number of very worthy charities from these deductions, and we certainly wouldn't want any change in that without full consultation. So, Chairman, that concludes my opening statement. I know we've been through some of these provisions previously, and if there are any questions arising, I'm happy to deal with them.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gleeson. Deputy Fair.
I want to thank Mr. Gleeson for his presentation this morning, and the whole process has been quite open and very, very helpful, and obviously it will help all of us to come to the proper decision as relation.
Deputy Pringle, have you anything?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Deputy Hayden.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks the officials for coming in before us this morning. I think it is worthwhile because the first time you were in, you were probably providing answers for questions that we didn't have at the time, and having met all the stakeholders, we're much better briefed now. That's where we're at. I have a number of different points I'd just like to raise with you on the basis of some of the presentations that were made to us, so if you bear with me, I hope they're kind of relatively in order. Just starting with Head 2, the Turf Club in their submission mentioned that point-to-points in general weren't mentioned in the CON or in existing legislation, and they questioned the need for them now to be for that to happen. And just to clarify, you said there in your presentation the method of registration. At present, you apply to the Hunt Club for a Hunter Cert, and then you register the Hunter Cert with the Turf Club, and they're two different fees. Is that correct? And then around the acceptance of entries and fees in point-to-points is all still handled locally by the Hunt Club. That's not changing in any way. And you might just outline then about prize money in relation to point-to-points. Is that funded out of that, or is how much money is in the prize money for the point-to-points? Around the money issue in general for the Turf Club, and how that the suggestion of what they have will be taken into account. Can you clarify, is that looking at the different funding streams they would have from, obviously they might have commercial interest, they might have interest outside of integrity services, or is it purely for the money from the integrity services? Does it take into account historic money that they might have in savings of either the Turf Club or the Hunt Committee, or is it purely that you only look at and take into account money raised from integrity services? That would be important. The issue was raised by the race courses about the need for, or that would be useful to have a proxy representative on the board. Would you see difficulties with how that would work? Is that something that the department will be open-minded to, that on days where, in particular for the representative race courses, if that person from their racecourse was having a meeting at the end, it was an important meeting on, they mightn't be there, and therefore then the Racecourse Association wouldn't be represented. So just what your views on that would be. Can I seek a bit of clarification around the Industry Services Committee? In general, one of the main things we had from every group to come in is board representation, and we have a challenge before us now as to how we look at that. If everybody is to have representation on the board could be quite large. But if you start picking some and not others, and everybody makes very valid arguments as to why they should have full representation. I know the Turf Club in their presentation, it referenced the UK Horseman's Group, which is an umbrella body. Do you see the Industry Services Committee being something similar or equivalent? And just on that, in Head 4, Part 7, 1F, it mentions stable employees. And in Head 6, 3C, stable employees are not explicitly named. It's talking about people directly employed in the industry. And you know, we had a compelling cases here from the jockeys who said that them being lumped in with people directly employed like stable staff, they wouldn't necessarily always have the same issues, and that's a valid point. But just on the point of the stable staff, I am conscious there's an awful lot of them. We have thousands of people employed as stable staff around the country, and to make sure that they are expressly represented or have their own head in would be important. So maybe that anomaly between the two heads is something that could be looked at, and you might just outline a little bit more about how you see the Industry Services Committee working. Just in relation to Head 5, the Turf Club would have been strong that on the view that where that goes beyond the Indicon report and goes beyond Smith and Williamson. They also made the point that the stall handlers and photo finish staff are under the HRI, and they were suggesting that then meant they couldn't bring in those staff if there were questions around the rules of racing, if there was any anomaly. Is that the case, or is there some way you see around that? I think the Turf Club would be interested, would be keen from what they were saying to see if that could come back in under the Turf Club end of things. And what about then also under Head 5, the Turf Club made a proposal that the racing regulatory body be funded directly by the department on the basis of a multi-annual basis, or at the least retain minimum financial independence. That obviously would be, the first part of that would be going against what is in the heads so far. And would you see any possibility of that, or what would be the argument against them being funded directly in a separate stream? And then also, again, linked with what I asked at the start about the financial independence is key. Just with regard to the Media Rights Committee, just seek clarification on that. That now is a committee that can have, can that committee now have people come in from the outside who aren't board members? And is that something that was the case in the past, or not? And then, look, there was a lot of concern raised about the whole issue of directives, and how the HRI would issue directives and how they would work. And in their submission, the racing regulatory body had talked about terms of trade, and questioned why they're called directives and not simply terms of trade or something similar, picking up on the HRI's presentation. They say the meaning and legal status of a directive is unclear, and that there can't be two rule-making bodies for the sport. Is there some clarity that can be provided throughout the legislation in the whole area of directives? Is there some way that it can be maybe a little bit more clarity provided to it? That's what I have for the minute, Chair. Thanks.
Okay. Senator, you've indicated
It's just one question. I think Mark's covered most of it there, but I suppose I thank Mr. Gleeson for the presentation. I suppose we've gone through this very comprehensively with all the stakeholders, and I suppose the biggest issue with the stakeholders is the makeup of the board, and we see where it's been reduced from 13 to 12, with the Minister going to appoint 3. I feel a lot of the stakeholders, and I think it is worth discussing or making a recommendation to the department in relation to this, because some of the stakeholders feel that they're being left out of the system by not getting a place on the board. So I'd welcome your comments in relation to it was indicated that it should be reduced from 13 to 12, but the Minister should have 3 appointments. I'd like your comments in relation to it. Could you envisage that we maybe would be able to propose that the board be increased by 2, maybe to 14 or 15, so maybe that we'd be able to cover all the stakeholders, because it is an important industry, as you've outlined, and it is important that everybody has a say in relation to the board of HRI. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. I think I'll come to Mr. Gleeson now, because there's a fair list of questions there. If you want to respond, and then I'll come back around to the members again.
Okay, as you say, there's a lot there, so I'll try and get through it all. The first issue maybe relates to the point-to-points and how they will operate, and we're very sensitive to the local input into point-to-points and the volunteerism, and we're aware that that's a highly sensitive issue. And we think there are sufficient safeguards in the general scheme to protect that. So just to indicate how the point-to-points work at the moment, first of all, HRI do provide about 1.5 million per annum to point-to-points. And that goes towards the provision of prize money. There's a grant of about €2,500 per fixture, as I understand it, and €500,000 goes to the National Hunt Club for integrity services at point-to-points. So to focus for a moment on the change in relation to point-to-points. So the only change in the HRI role in relation to point-to-points proposed in the general scheme is that the registration functions of hunter certificates and participants in point-to-point steeplechases will be carried out along with all other registration functions within HRI. Now, that's entirely separate from the issue of hunter certificates and the acceptance of horse racing entries. So those functions have always resided with the local hunt clubs, and the funding associated with those functions resides with the hunt clubs. That's the issue of the certificates and the acceptance of horse racing entries. There will be no change in that, no change. So from the perspective of the person on the ground organising point-to-points, there will be no visible or actual change. So what we're talking about here is a streamlining of a registration function, and the fees from the registration functions will be streamlined into an administrative system in HRI, with no change on the ground, no change in the issue of hunter certificates, in the acceptance of horse racing entries, or in the arrangement of those point-to-points. Okay, so I think that's a very important point to clarify. The second thing you spoke about, Deputy, was the funding. And so it has always been the case, and maybe this question of the direct funding from the department can be dealt with here as well. It has always been the case that we've had this cascade of funding from HRI, from the department to HRI to the Turf Club. And HRI, just to be clear about it, is a state body established for the purposes of administering horse racing. It's a state body established for that purpose. And it's entirely appropriate in our view that you would have this cascade of funding to other relevant bodies from HRI. And we wouldn't consider it to be appropriate to change that. Now, within that, of course, you have to be careful to protect the independence of the integrity function. And again, there are a number of checks and balances provided for in the general scheme to provide for that. Firstly, if you look at the composition of the board as proposed in the bill, we have 3 Turf Club members on the board. We have 3 ministerial nominees on the board, and we have a broad range of representatives of the racing sector. So I think there's a very important kind of balance struck there in the composition of that board in terms of ensuring that integrity functions are carried out correctly. The second thing is that what we're providing for is that in the context of seeking funding from HRI, and this is taxpayers' money, it's 5, 6 or 7 million euros worth of taxpayers' money, that HRI will be able to take into account funding streams to Turf Club deriving from its statutory functions in relation to integrity, and only in relation to those statutory functions. So I think you have to consider here what structure we have at the moment, and we have a very unusual governance structure here, which we're not starting with a blank page. So we have a state agency which administers racing, and we have what is essentially a private body. And the private body, for the purposes of this legislation, carries out certain statutory functions. And in the context of carrying out those statutory functions, it's called the Racing Regulatory Body. So in its private capacity, the Turf Club may well carry on all kinds of activities. They may run race courses, they may rent gallops, they may establish hotels, they may have interests in commercial enterprises. That's not what we're talking about here. All we're saying is that when determining how much taxpayers' money the racing regulatory body needs to carry out integrity functions provided for by statute, that you have to take account, it would be bizarre not to take account, of funding deriving from the exercise of those functions. So just to be crystal clear about this, the Turf Club's private funding in its capacity as a private club is not affected here at all. We're only talking about taking into account the funding deriving from the statutory functions it carries out here. I think that's a really very important point. You mentioned the question of the proxy members of a state board. Well, it's possible to do that. Personally, I don't think that's appropriate. I think if you're appointed to a state board, it's a very serious position. You need continuity. You need an appreciation of what went on at previous meetings. For the sake of good order, I think an appointee to a board is an appointee to a board. So I certainly would be absolutely opposed to the idea that when you engage in something as serious as participating in a state board, that you could bring a proxy along. It's not like voting in a shareholders meeting in a company. This is a different kind of engagement, and you're engaging on a range of policy issues which require continuity from meeting to meeting. So that's my position on the question of the proxies. You mentioned the Industry Services Committee. So, and you know, Indicon recognises that when you have a representative board, there are strengths, many strengths deriving from the fact that it's representative. But equally, if you look at kind of international best practice, and not just among state agencies, but you know, generally, I think there's a broad recognition that smaller boards tend to function more effectively. So, in relation to the specific provisions in these general scheme, I suppose what I'd say about that is it's not an arbitrary. What we've included here isn't arbitrary. It's based on an exercise conducted by Indicon where there was broad consultation and an examination of international best practice. And therefore, what's in our general scheme is reflective of the conclusions that Indicon came to. Now, it's always the case with a representative board that everybody wants to be represented. That's inevitable, and so you try to strike an appropriate balance between representation and between effective running of a board. Now, when we speak about the Industry Services Committee, which is a new vehicle representing jockeys and staff, stable staff, permanent staff and staff in the industry. So the representation mechanism there is that that board will be able to appoint, its chairman will serve on the board. So there is representation for jockeys and permanent staff and stable staff. Sorry, jockeys and qualified riders, persons employed in the horse racing industry, and persons employed directly in the horse racing industry. So that group will have its own committee for the very first time. It will elect its own chairman, and the chairman will serve on the board. So there will be representation on the board for those people.
Point, because we get lost if we go away from it. Just the point I was making was that in Head 6, Part 3C, it's persons employed directly in the horse racing industry. In Head 4, it's explicitly referenced as stable staff. That just might be taken on board when the final drafting has happened, because I think that is an important distinction.
Absolutely, Deputy. If you know, they're intended to be comprehended in the wording that's there, but I accept there's an inconsistency between the two sections. We'll be sure they're explicitly referenced in the. So obviously, if that's part of the report emanating from the committee, we'll take it on board. Now, you asked me quite a specific question then about stall holders. If you could just give me one moment just to... So, Deputy, sorry for the delay, but just on the question of stallholder. So if you go back to the 2001 Act, this provision really hasn't changed. The provision and maintenance of mobile track equipment, including starting stalls, photo finish, camera patrol equipment, and any other such equipment agreed from time to time between HRI and the racing regulatory body to provide the racing regulatory body with photographs, films, sound recordings and other connected materials or data generated. So these functions in relation to stallholders have always resided with HRI, and there's no proposal to change it.
Is the change, through the Chair, is the change not in the new proposal in the heads under head 5CK that to provide and maintain mobile track equipment is what was there, and the change is now to provide, maintain and operate? And just in general terms, the point that Turf Club made that it's not ideal to have the photo finish staff, I think, are included as well as the stall handlers, that if there was an integrity issue, they're saying they can't bring them in and question them on that. Just, is that the case? Is that your view of it? Is that a potential anomaly?
Yeah, so, Deputy, I mean, what I'm advised is that word operate is a reflection of current practice. It's the way it's always been done, and it was provided for in the 2001 Act. That word is a new word, but it's a reflection of current practice, so it's not our intention to change that. The question of the financial independence of the racing regulatory body, well, I think I've dealt with that, and the question of this cascade of accountability and whether the racing regulatory body should get funding directly from the department. Well, it's not my view that it should. There's no change proposed in that regard in the current draft scheme. I think that should be made clear. This isn't a change, but in the context of any delegation of functions from a department in the context of the establishment of any state agency, there is this cascade of accountability, and I think the one we've provided for here, which is a strengthening of existing provisions but not any fundamental change in that cascade, I think that's appropriate.
Okay. Deputy or Senator O'Neill had a query then about the
board. I think he dealt with it in Senator or Deputy Hayden asked the same question. It's just they feel that a smaller committee works more efficiently.
No, that's
so
okay.
yeah.
Deputy.
Just in relation to the smaller board, it seems to me that lots of consultants in this country get big money for proposing what becomes a fashion, and then the fashions change and magic numbers come in. Other than that, some people irrationally think 13 is an unlucky number. Does it make a huge significant difference if it's 13 or 14 rather than 12? Now, there's an argument in favour of both, because particularly in a board where there are people with interest, because these have all been nominated by interest except the three with the minister, you could easily get people standing outside the meeting. We had a farcical situation recently where there was a board, I think, of 19 and 20, but only 5 people wound up making the big decision because everyone else was put outside the door for one reason or another. So how wedded are the department to this magic 12? Or is it just kind of a figure and give or take? we're in around the number. The second question I have, as you said yourself, you're giving 3 out of 12, that's a quarter of the seats on the board to a group called the Turf Club. And you also say to carry out statutory functions under the Act. Now, my understanding is that the Turf Club is a self-perpetuating private body that doesn't have open membership. And that it's not possible for anybody who wants to get in, who isn't chosen by those who are already in, to get into it. Would it not be appropriate at this stage, in the interest of openness, transparency, of citizens' rights, as all the things that we aspire to in a proper functioning republic, that the Turf Club would be obliged to have some open system of membership before it would be given statutory functions and before it would be given 3 seats on the board? And I'd be very interested in how the department can justify giving a private body, which is self-perpetuating in its membership, in other words, existing membership invite the new members, and which the great and good, in which the ordinary people are excluded from if they're not part of the great and good clique, and invited by the membership, and we're giving them both statutory functions and 3 seats on the board. And I was wondering how you justify that in the present thinking on good governance and openness and citizens' rights and all the rest.
Okay. Any other member? Deputy, are you okay?
Yeah, no, with the race courses as well. I mean,
yeah. Well, before bringing in non-members, I'll invite you in to speak. Then.
Yeah. One of the points about the Association of Irish Race Courses. I mean, there's a lot of work being done by those, and one of the proposals is to, with the HRI to be omnipotent. They're going to have total control of everything. I mean, a lot of you people don't understand that the HRI is a runaway train in terms of charges. I've made this point before. There's no end. I mean, I heard you saying there a few minutes ago about they're going to have a look at this about point-to-points. And I mean, at least with point-to-points, I mean, if we're charged, we know what we're getting. And there's an end result there. And we see ordinary people there, all the ordinary folk there on a Sunday, giving up their Sundays and Saturdays right across the various courses, the point-to-point courses. And they're doing it on a voluntary basis and looking after things, and they take the money. And when we know it's all been in trying to invest in improving things, so I have concern about that, because I mean, if they're going to take over, if they're going to have the financial management of all aspects of Irish racing, there is a concern that HRI would be looking into the finances of race courses. Race courses, see, they have control of the race courses and ownership of race courses. They allocate everything. Programs and fixtures and everything else. How much more power are we going to give to this body? That I think we should be circumscribing some of the powers they're getting. I know you talk about being a state authority and all like that, but I've given lots of examples, and I was amazed by the reaction that I evoked from a lot of people out there. Ordinary people who are trying to bring forward horses, and even people trying to breed, and especially in the national hunt areas and that. Not everybody is a successful. They're not all going to Goffs, and they're not bidding 2 and 3 million for. There's a lot of people there bidding. They're glad to get something for 3 and 4,000. And the next minute they're loaded out with charges all over the place. And what worries me about giving all this power is that it'll be the runaway train again, where you don't have any choice. You don't have any haggling. They lay down the law. And they're nice, not too bad as sinecures within it. I don't like this idea that race courses, I know my own race course, Jerry Sibby in Kilbeggan, very well run. But I mean, they're running on a very tight ship. And if HRI, if everything is going to be given to them, and if you look at under section 10, is it of the thing, section 10, 1G. And 1M, the negotiation of all income from media rights. So the media rights don't belong to HRI. They belong to the actual race courses. So why should HRI poke their nose at shortly? I mean, where is it going to end? I mean, very often the media rights is the only thing that, actually, if there wasn't media rights, there'd be no races. I mean, if they like it, the skies and them were putting in a few shillings, you'd have no prize funds, you'd have nothing, you know, very often. And that's that. So, I mean, you know, up to now, as I understood it, both HRI and the Association of Racecourses were jointly involved in the negotiation of media rights. But is HRI going to subsume all this function to themselves? And, you know, I want to ensure that racecourses that are out there that have put, you know, I mean, they struggled through the very difficult times and have survived and carried out improvements with state investment. I want to acknowledge that as well. I mean, but it's all been for the benefit of ordinary patrons, people who aren't multi-millionaires, but are ordinary people who, very often pensioners, who go in there and then, thankfully, they can avail of their pass and they avail of the reduced rate going in. And that's carried as well, and that's acknowledged. But you know, I know the Association of Racecourses have made the point that they're concerned that obviously, you know, they acknowledge that HRI has a function in negotiating income from media rights belonging to HRI, but that they have legal rights to negotiate income derived from third parties, which is the racecourses themselves. And to make the point that if you go back to the 1994 Act, all of that was vested in the actual racecourses themselves, under Section 61. So I just want to make that point that I would hope that what is up to now, at least with joint consultation, because that's extremely important in that context. So I would like a view from you to make sure that, and an assurance that the racecourses, their interests are not going to be dispensed with or just thrown out, and especially where you have HRI having such an input and such a strength in terms of racecourses themselves, and the great power to have in terms of allocation of fixtures and everything else.
I'll let you take those three, and then I'll come back to Deputy Lawler and Senator. Oh, sorry, Deputy Pringle as a member of the committee. Would you something?
Quick points.
Yeah.
Pretty good. Just in relation to the integrity functions, and take what you say in relation to the payments, fees and stuff go through HRA to pass on to the regulatory body for the integrity functions. And but I was wondering, is there a potential there, or can the potential be minimised for, obviously HRA has a statutory function to promote racing, and the racing regulatory body has a function to control racing, and there could be times when both of those would be clash and have different interests. Is there a potential there, or can the potential be minimised, that HRI can't restrict funding for integrity services in a way that inhibits the actual integrity of racing? I think that would be very, very important. And I just wondered if you could talk a wee bit about how you see the Act balancing those out. And just related to that as well then, in the definitions in Head 2, the Turf Club have asked that integrity services be amended to include integrity services provided away from racecourses, which are not specifically related to the running of a particular race or race fixture. I just wonder what the department's view would be on that amendment of the definition there, because I think that could be quite important. And just then, finally, in relation to the obligation on the regulatory body to consult with HRI around the rules of racing. Now, obviously, consulting means you talk to, and you take their views, and the natural course of things, as you consult, you will take some of the views on board. But consultant doesn't place an obligation on you to take those views on board and to implement those views. And just maybe if you'd clarify that as well.
Okay. Yeah, Mr. Gleeson.
Okay, Chairman. The first question, I think, was about the status of the Turf Club and the conferring of statutory functions on a private body. So I suppose the first thing you have to consider is that when we deal with all of this and with horse racing in Ireland, we're not starting from a blank page. We're dealing with a kind of long tradition of 150 years of the Turf Club, who have performed integrity functions in a way that's brought a degree of credit to the industry in Ireland, and the industry in Ireland is very highly regarded. And since 1994, we've established a state body for developing the industry, because apart from being a sport, it's a very important industry that provides 17,000 jobs and exports exceeding 200 million and output of 1 billion. So, you know, it's a big industry as well as being a sport. So we don't start from a blank page. The general scheme here isn't conferring new functions on the turf club. These are the functions that they've always had. And for some considerable time, they've had those functions on the basis of statutory provision. But what they do is they bring the turf club within a tighter governance structure so that their finances can be examined in the context of determining what kind of funding is required for integrity. So, again, Deputy, I mean, I take your point of principle. The department doesn't control the internal processes of the turf club, nor does it intend to, nor will it. But we're not starting from a blank page. We're starting from a well-established structure here, which has served the industry well, we believe.
Question to the Chair. It's very, very easy, I know myself, right? Did it with various bodies that were technically private, to make it a condition of recognition by the state that's an open membership, and that's not a self-perpetuating club. And you could just say that's the way it is. No, as you say, you're changing other things in relation to Turf Club in terms of finance and so on, reporting, because the world changes and it's not the world of 150 years ago, which was much more, if I might say so, paternalistic. And it just seems to me in 2014 that it's inappropriate that a club with a closed membership, that is by invitation only, is been giving statutory functions when one line in a bill would say could force them to make the membership application process as an open process. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, that's the point that's made, but you've responded as you see. It's not proposed to do that in the legislation at the moment, anyway.
No.
Okay. The other thing was just before that, you mentioned that the size of the boards came up again. Was it a deal breaker, essentially?
So, Deputy, I mean, you mentioned the size of the board, and I mean, all I can do is present the facts and the reasons we selected the board size provided for in the general scheme. And I would simply make the point that it wasn't an arbitrary figure. It was based on recommendations by Indicon, and their work was based on a series of consultations and examining of best practice. So that's the basis on which we picked this number. It's the basis on which we decided on the composition of the board. So I'll simply say that the committee will have its own views on the composition and size of the board, which we'll have to consider. If some alternative view comes through in the context of a report from the committee, we'll have to consider that. But I would simply say that we didn't pick an arbitrary figure. We picked the figure proposed by somebody who would examine the question very deeply.
The answer to that is you picked a figure proposed by Indicom, and Indicom kind of made it very clear, I take it, that 11 or 13 would be hugely different. But a very specific Indicom and saying it had to be 12, it couldn't be 11, it couldn't be 13, that it had to be that magic figure. That was, you know, some really magic advantage of 12 rather than...
Well, I mean, Indicon were commissioned to do some work to examine the structures here, and they come up with a recommendation, and it's a recommendation, that we've taken on board. Well, precisely, and the composition of the board. So, as I say, it may well be that the committee may have a different view, and if it does, we'll have to consider that in the fullness of time.
Sorry,
That's the point I was making. We're not spending a huge number of hours listening to various interests in a different way than Indicon, and taking on board those. I just want to know, what's the status of our recommendation in terms of responding to the general heads of the bill? Where does it go? Is it binned? Is it evaluated? Or what happens at the end?
As good a time as any to get that point clarified, yeah. I mean, we will be finalising this as we're under a certain amount of pressure to get it done, but we do intend filing a report on all the contributions, and we haven't concluded yet, but we'll have to make some recommendation. We will make some recommendations. We don't have to, but we will.
We will.
Yeah. So the status of that report when it hits your desks.
Well, it seems to me that, the status of this process is not just a matter for the department. It's a broader question. But clearly, we've gone through a process which I think has been a very valuable process, actually, and we'll probably end up with something slightly better than what we proposed originally as a result of it. So the department will receive the report, and we'll have to consider it. And if as a result of the report we're required to change the heads in any substantial way, it'll have to go back to government, and then it'll go into drafting. Clearly, it's something that will be sent by the committee to the department, and it's something the department will have to consider very seriously, because we've been through quite a serious process and a series of consultations here, which we'll have to.
Yeah, that's grand. Now, Deputy Penrose had a couple of questions regarding the strength of the power and influence of HRI.
Yeah, and we discussed the media rights as well. And just to be clear, again, we're not starting from a blank page here. So, HRI is the state agency established to administer and develop horse racing, and it has been since 2001. It replaced the Horse Racing Authority in 2001. In terms of media rights, there is no provision here to change anything about the media rights, with one sole exception. The sole exception is that the Media Rights Committee now is at liberty to bring in non-members of HRI to advise it, and that's on the basis that there's a recognition that you might require particular commercial or media or other expertise to inform media rights. The numbers are going up. The number in the Media Rights Committee is going up to from 3 to 5 to accommodate potentially additional members. You're absolutely right when you say there's a kind of a joint approach to media rights between the race courses and HRI. That will not change. Race courses, of course, are still represented on the HRI board. As I understand it, the race courses own the media rights, but on the basis of an agreement. It was felt that from a national perspective, from the point of view of developing an industry here and getting the best bang for the buck, that the media rights should be negotiated as a collective. And I don't think nothing has happened in recent times to change that view. You spoke about the charges from HRI. As I understand, the charges have been reduced by 10% this year.
They have, after the publicity and me.
Well, and that's the way.
And it should be pared back more.
And that's fine. And in fact, Deputy, I think you have a point, but the streamlining provided for in this bill should reduce the overall cost of administering horse racing. And I think it could well allow scope for further reduction of charges to participate in horse racing, which would be a desirable outcome. But those are matters for HRI, they're not matters for the department. That's a day-to-day operational matter. But the framework being laid down now here in this general scheme should allow for a reduction in administrative costs, which could certainly manifest itself in reduced charges to the industry. Deputy Pringle, you asked about the financing and the protections for the integrity function and the independence of the integrity function. So, I've already spoken about the general checks and balances in terms of the composition of boards and things like that. But there is actually a unique feature, at least I think it's unique in this legislation. When the RRB negotiates its budget with HRI, if there is a fundamental disagreement on the budget, there's an arbitration procedure provided for here. So, and that's a very unusual provision. And in any other circumstances, I'd almost say it's inappropriate, but it's there specifically in recognition of the need for an absolute independence in terms of integrity. So, first of all, you have a representative board, which obviously has a say in the negotiation of the budgets, and we have 3 RRB people on the board, we'll have 3 ministerial nominees, and we'll have representatives from across the spectrum of interests in horse racing. But we also have the specific arbitration clause. So if there's and this has always been here, so if there's a disagreement between RRB and HRI in the context of its budgetary negotiations at the start of the year, an arbitrator can be called in. Now, that provision has always been there. It has never been invoked. So it's inevitable and probably appropriate in circumstances like this that there will be tension between two negotiating bodies when budgets are being negotiated. That's to be expected, and it's probably a sign of a healthy process. But we do have this arbitration provision, which has never been used, but it's still there. Binding.
Okay.
Never been used. Never been used.
Okay. Just in relation to the consultation of.
What you said is absolutely correct. Consultation means consultation. It doesn't mean anything else. So it's absolutely appropriate, I think, that if you're changing the rules of racing, that you would, in any event, I presume, consult with bodies or stakeholders that might be affected by it. I think that's a sign of a healthy process. But consultation does not mean they have any imprimatur over the outcome. Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. Okay.
And just finally, Chairman, the one on the definition of integrity functions.
Yeah, well, you know, we've reflected on that, and I suppose, and it comes back to what Deputy O'Keefe said. What we have here is a very unusual situation where what's essentially a private body has a range of statutory functions, and in a sense, what you're talking about here is providing very broad, strong policing powers to a private body. Now, there are sensitivities around that, and I suppose we feel that what's here, first of all, there's been no change to that definition. That's the definition that's always been here. So we feel that it's appropriate that the Turf Club would have those powers around the tracks and in the context of applying integrity on race courses. Where work is required outside those parameters, we do have the Garda authorities, we do have departmental investigators who frequently work cheek by jowl with Turf Club people to examine things like breaches of animal remedies regulations, and they would have all the necessary powers and authorisations to do what the Turf Club is seeking to do here outside of the tracks. So, look, it's a balancing act. Is it appropriate to expand the remit of the Turf Club beyond tracks? I just have some doubts about the wisdom or even the legal propriety of giving a private body these very strong policing powers outside of its strict remit as provided within the regulations. And this is something we did consider, and what I'm saying to you now reflects the view of our own Legal Services Division. So that's where we stand on that.
But surely the more agencies you have involved in the integrity function, the more difficult it is to manage it effectively as well.
That is a perspective, and I acknowledge that that's a perspective. But in practice, the reality is that when things happen off track, they're generally done in collaboration with the department. So we would have investigations people who would be empowered under various individual pieces of legislation to do the kinds of things that the Turf Club is anxious to do off track. So in practice, I think that system works quite well.
Okay. Call now Deputy Lawler.
Thanks very much, Chair, for allowing me to ask some questions here to the department. And I must say the whole process has been enlightening for not only members here, but for the public who are watching and those people who've made submissions to as well. Just a number of questions. The first, you indicated before the pre-legislative stage of this that you had a number of meetings with various bodies. Could you identify who those bodies were? How many meetings you had with HRI and how many meetings you had with the racing regulatory body? Thank you. The Indicon report, and Deputy Hayden has mentioned it already, so I won't repeat the question, which was just on no mention of point-to-points in it yet. It was an integral part of this legislation here too as well. So there's change in this legislation. You also mentioned there was no need for change with regard to something Deputy Hayden mentioned earlier on, which is regarding the regulatory body's role in stall handling, photo finishes, things like that, they don't have a role in bringing in those people who they may wish to query. So I think a change there would be very helpful to the whole regulation of the body. So maybe you might probably change that piece in that to bring that in more into under the role of the regulatory body. People here talking about, I'm confused, you may clarify things. There will be 13 members of the board, right? That includes 4 members appointed by the minister. The 4th member being the chairman of the board, right? Can you clarify that that is the case, right? Because everyone talks about 12 members of the board. So in actual fact, there are 13 members of the board, 4 of which will be appointed by the minister. So you can clarify that for us there too as well. The media rights with regard to and I agree with Deputy Penrose, it's a huge part going forward of the funding for the racing industry. The media rights legally has been proven to be part and parcel of the ownership of the racetracks. Can I just ask you to make a change in Head 6, Section 3.2?
Just so as we're clear on this, you can query, can a change be made?
Yeah, well, can a change be made?
Yeah, you can't make a recommendation here today.
Right, can a change be made?
And just on the first question, I'm going to rule that out of order. You can't ask this, that's not part of the general scheme. Many meetings were held. Sorry, it's not to do with what our purpose is here. You can put a question to department officials through other channels, but not through here. Okay?
It would be instant to find out.
Well, sorry, Deputy. Sorry, Deputy, I've accommodated you here.
All right, that's okay.
And I don't want, we've done this in good spirit, but that's outside the realm and the responsibility of this committee's role and function here.
All right, okay. I rephrase that question with regard to Section 3.2. Is it possible that the department may look before the legislation is brought before the Dáil to the possibility of deleting a word may and put in the word should? There is a fear there that the HRI, it's on Section 3.2 under Head 6, says that the Media Rights Committee shall consist of no more than 5 members appointed by HRI and may include members who are not members of HRI. Sometimes in the future there may arise a situation where there may be a conflict between HRI and the race courses, particularly those race courses not owned by HRI. And there should be more outside members rather than members of HRI, if that is possible. On it's strange. The racing regulatory body should consult, and yet HRI can issue directives with regard to the rules of racing or the integrity. Maybe could we change that? Maybe is it possible to have a look at that instead of issuing directives that it could consult as well, so that there's a consultation process instead of one telling the other what to do. There should be sort of both ways around. When HRI were part of this bill under the Independent report is for streamlining and savings. When I asked HRI on this, they couldn't indicate how many people would be let go, where savings would be. Can you maybe indicate to me where you might see savings and how long will it take for the process to take place? Can I, just in general with regard to HRI, and it's probably not related to it, but it's maybe we still haven't got the 2013 annual report from HRI. Is the department happy with this?
Again, Deputy, you're straying outside the role of this committee, and the members of the committee have stuck to the task here of the general scheme. I mean, that's the general question. I think
funding, and this is all about
you're being creative
like
with your arguments there. It's not really. I mean, the HRI, we have an Indicon report looking at the whole industry. I take the question about consultation and directives to clarify what the meaning is. General operation rules of racing, which is the overall overarching direction that racing should take as a directive, and everybody works within it, be they HRI, regulatory body or anybody else, and it has to do a lot of animal welfare, to do with betting and propriety in lots of ways. But I mean, I think it does need to be clarified. But with regard to the annual report, I mean, I don't think that's relevant for today's discussion, with all due respect.
Yeah, well, the bill is on the horse
General
racing
scheme.
bill.
General scheme.
Yeah. Surely part of the general scheme is the annual report.
I don't agree. Yeah, the general scheme of this bill.
Okay, all right.
Deputy
I'll
Senator
ask, it in
Bradford.
another I'll ask it in another method.
Okay.
Some other time. That's it. Thanks very
Okay,
much.
Senator Bradford.
Thanks very much, Chairman. I just want to say I would be very much supportive of both the themes and perhaps the tone of the contribution from the previous speaker, Deputy Lawler. So I won't harrow the ground he has ploughed. Just one or two observations, Mr. Deason. You used one fascinating phrase from my perspective there in relation to the point-to-point section. You said that to all intents and purposes there would be a perception of no change. Now normally it's the politicians who talk about perception, and maybe the other side of the table talk about reality, but you know, I can see there may be no perception of any significant change, but change will come about as a result of this. And I go back to the question of why is the point-to-point sphere and sector in the scheme at all. It is working well. It's a sector without which we would have no national hunt industry. Not broken in my view. I'm just not sure why we're attempting to fix it. But you might just comment a little further on that. And again, to go back to ground already covered, integrity services and the regulatory body. We had a very, in my view, powerful presentation here a month or so ago from the regulatory body, asking very serious questions about, you know, ensuring its independence into the future. And can you be very categorical that from the point of view of the integrity body, that there will be no change, that it will have its full powers and flexibility to continue as heretofore? I mean, obviously, if I was the Minister of Agriculture presiding and assisting by way of financial support an industry as big as the Irish horse racing industry, it would be very neat and tidy from my perspective that all power and responsibility and role would be channeled into HRI. It simply would make my job much easier. But I think our current balance between HRI and the regulatory body is working quite well, and I wouldn't like to see that it being rebalanced to any significant degree. So I'm supportive of what the previous speaker said, and you might just reflect again on the whole issue of the point-to-point industry, because perception or not, there will actually be a change, and I would be worried that it might impact on how the point-to-point sphere is currently working with its volunteerism and its local meets and its whole, spirit of country enterprise, which is at the core of its success.
Is that it? Yeah. Okay. Mr. Leeson.
Okay, so thank you, deputies. So, firstly, this question of the point-to-points and the lack of a reference in Indicon to point-to-points. So, just to be clear about it, we had an Indicon report that made a broad range of recommendations about the administration of horse racing and governance and financing and a number of other issues. After Indicon, a committee comprising members of the RRB and HRI was established, and they commissioned a report by Smith and Williamson into how the administration of the system might be streamlined. So, although it's true that there's no explicit reference to point-to-points in Indicon, it is implicit in the whole idea of streamlining. And there is an explicit reference to point-to-points in Smith and Williamson. And what we're proposing here in the general scheme is precisely what was proposed in Smith and Williamson, which is to move the registration functions, only the registration functions, into HRI, who already have registration functions across a range of other areas. Deputy Bradford, I did use this word perception, and the reason I used it was because there's a perception out there that what's happening here will interfere with volunteerism and in the way point-to-points are run at a local level. So I'll remove that word perception now from what I'm saying, and I'll say there will be no change to the running of point-to-points at local level as a result of what we're proposing here.
Registration of the horses running.
Only the register, and that's only that funding money handed in, which doesn't go back to local hunt clubs anyway, will now be handled through a single administrative stream. The funding for the local hunt